So an ESPN playoff projection doesn't have Oregon making the 12-team playoff, and that is just not as crazy as you'd think.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. This episode brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. New customers, bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get yourself started. Are there going to be moves on the coaching staff? I mean, maybe. There's one move in conference, though, that none of us are going to really like, and Oregon's weapons, all coming up on today's show. But I want to start with this. So there was a projection from ESPN. I haven't loved their FPI for a long time. I don't think it gets a lot of things right. It's not wildly off base, but it projected a 12-team playoff next year, and the teams they had in were as follows. The top four seeds with byes: Georgia, Penn State, Utah, Louisville. Those would be the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, and ACC champs. I don't know about that. Bama, Texas, Notre Dame, Michigan had the home playoff games. Ohio State, LSU, North Carolina, Boise rounded out the Final Four. So no Oregon included. And my initial reaction to this really made me think. Like, how could any matrix, any calculation, any person look at Oregon's schedule and think, oh, they're not going to make the playoff next year? Well, two ways that could happen. First way is really pretty simple, and why I say this isn't crazy. I want to make this clear. This is not my take. I expect Oregon to be in the playoff and win at least 10 games next season. That is a baseline standard for success that I have for the Ducks program year in and year out. This year is no different along those lines. If they go 10-2, I think they get in. More on that in a moment. But the really simple explanation for how Oregon would miss the college football playoff next year is Dante Moore doesn't reach his full potential or come anywhere close to it and looks like the same guy who was at UCLA in 2023 as a true freshman. Now, that's not what I'm saying is most likely to happen. But is that completely ridiculous? Totally absurd? Go look at the number of highly touted blue chip 5-star quarterback prospects all across the country who in their first full year starting don't exactly live up to all the potential. But by year 2 or year 3, suddenly they get there. The Trevor Lawrences of the world are such anomalies. Such anomalies. He walked into Clemson and did not play, I don't believe, his true freshman season, by the way. He sat for a year, which is why I'm optimistic about what Dante Moore can be. But his first year starting, he took Clemson and won a national championship. That's not normal. That's the exception, not the rule. The number of 5-star quarterbacks that don't reach their full potential or that just don't end up being good quarterbacks. Heck, Ty Thompson isn't even a quarterback anymore. He's still playing college football. He's transferring to tight end position-wise down at Tulane. It doesn't always work out for those guys. So if Dante Moore has the turnover bug and that hasn't been coached out of him because he just hasn't had enough reps in this offense, then yeah, I could see Oregon going 9-3. I really could. You could lose at Iowa. You could lose at Penn State. You could lose at Washington. Easy. Now, Oregon is likely to be favored in probably 2 of those games. I don't know. I got more on Penn State coming later on today's show. But those road contests are not to be trifled with. But Dante Moore, assuming that Dante Moore is just going to come in, light the world on fire, go be a Heisman Trophy contender and Oregon's 3rd straight finalists again, I can see it happening. I'm not expecting that. I think Dante Moore plays at a Heisman level, assuming, and I think he will return, assuming he returns for 2026. If he starts this year, I bumped the table there. If he starts this year and then gets a bunch of experience and shows progression over the course of this upcoming year, and then comes back for 2026 and he's got the same offense, a lot of the same weapons, and another good offensive line and a good team around him, yeah, that's when I'd say, okay, let's hit the accelerator on the Dante Moore Heisman hype train. Because for this year, I don't have that at all. I want Dante Moore to play well. I want him to show sign, but I don't expect him to carry Oregon to a national championship in his first year starting. The number of quarterbacks starting their first full year of college football that take a team to a national championship is few and far between. There is not a long list. The quarterbacks that were just in the national championship, it was their first year with that school. It wasn't their first year starting in college football. There are a few things to learn. And Dante Moore has some experience. That's great. He has not started a full season because remember, he got benched because he kept throwing it to the other team. So that's the simplest version of how Oregon would miss the playoff at 9-3. The second thought I had was, are they thinking Oregon goes 10-2 and then that doesn't get them into the playoff? I have a hard time seeing that. In the Big Ten or SEC, there seems to be a consensus that 10-2 gets you in. Because think about Tennessee this past year, for instance. There was never any question, debate, or anything hinting at the idea that Tennessee shouldn't be into the playoff. Or Ohio State, for that matter. Ohio State's best win in the regular season was, I believe, Indiana. They had a weak non-conference slate. They beat Indiana, lost to Oregon, lost to Michigan. Those were two of their toughest games in the Big Ten slate, but they beat Indiana and got in. If Oregon had losses to, let's say, Iowa and Penn State and beats Washington, and Washington is an 8-9 win team next year, which I think they could be. I don't know if they will be, but they could be. Then 10-2 maybe doesn't look super strong. And you had 10-2 teams in Miami and BYU last year that got no consideration, less consideration than 9-3 SEC that got themselves into the playoff. But I don't even think that's the secondary consideration for how Oregon could miss the playoff going into next year. I think it's just that they're resetting at so many different spots. You have one returning starting offensive lineman with 3 contributors likely to be on the 2 deep. That's an adjustment. We saw it this year. There will be an adjustment in all likelihood next year as well. I expected to have better continuity because Poncho was back starting at center, but you can't guarantee that that offensive line is just going to be as good as they were this year, which was really, really good. Not as good as the year prior, but right away at least, I don't think they'll play at that same sort of level. Defensively, you're losing a lot of guys on the D-line. I'm bullish about what Oregon's defensive line can be. It's not as good as last year. Top 6 defensive backs, top 2 wide receivers, plus your top 2 tight ends. That's a lot to replace. So maybe the whole team around Dante Moore doesn't have the cohesion and consistency they need to get them to 10-2. And maybe they end up going 9-3. I don't think it'd be a calamitous season. I think it'd be a disappointment, but I don't think it would be, oh my gosh, the house is burning down, this is all terrible, you fire everyone. Like, no, it'd just be, that's not what this team was fully capable of. So I just saw that and it got me thinking, how could Oregon miss the playoff? And I thought, it's actually kind of simple. Dante Moore's still learning to play quarterback. Oregon's replacing a lot. Maybe 10-2 isn't good enough to get there. I think it's probably those first 2 things, but hey, what do I know, you know? Sometimes I know things, other times I don't. So let me know what you think I do or do not know in the comments below, or hit me up on Twitter, or become a Locked On Ducks insider. All great ways to get in touch. So, is Oregon going to lose a coaching staff member? I mean, eventually, yes. It's just a matter of whether that is right now. Ohio State coming for another Oregon coach? First, a reminder, this episode brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here. 1 game, 2 teams, 1 team that I'm rooting for more than the other. Endless possibilities. Not for who I'm rooting for, though. Fly, Eagles, fly. And there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting the coin toss for you sickos out there, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. Plus, bets are available for Oregon. Big Ten championship odds, second only to Ohio State. National championship odds, top 5 behind Texas and Ohio State. Third, last I had checked. Win total, 10.5. Big number. Big number right there. If you think you know how that's playing out, download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official partner of Super Bowl 59. I had to relax myself with a little second segment sit there because I don't know how everybody's going to feel about that first segment. I'm anxious to read your comments tomorrow night. So, there was a report from, I believe it was Nakos over at On3, listing candidates for Ohio State's vacant defensive coordinator job. And one of the names listed on there as a potential replacement, Chris Hampton, currently Oregon's defensive backs coach and co-defensive coordinator. Now, he came in from Tulane last year, and the defense took a sizable step forward. They took another step forward this year, and I think we're all hoping in a couple of specific moments, the biggest games of the season, the defense can take another step forward in the 2020, I'd say 6th season, but 25 as well. You never know. I'm not always right about things. I'd love to be wrong there, but we'll just have to see. We're less than 8 months away. We're around 8 months away. We will get there. I promise we will get there. But we'll also get to the point one day where Chris Hampton is no longer on Oregon staff. And this has not been necessarily imminent. It's just a name that got thrown out on a list, but it's not the first time his name has popped up for a Power 4 defensive coordinator position. The other one was Florida State. They hired a guy from Nebraska instead. I don't know if Ryan Day's actively considering Chris Hampton or if this is more just a, hey, this guy would make a lot of sense. But certainly I expect Hampton at some point to be a full-time coordinator somewhere. He'd be able to make more money and have more responsibilities as well, because I'm fairly certain. I frankly wasn't that sure in 2023, but in 24, I became certain, just, watching stuff and following along as closely as I could, trying to see how coaches were acting on the sideline. Tosh Lupoy's calling the defensive plays. It's not Dan Lanning. I don't believe it's Chris Hampton. But in 2023, I frankly wasn't entirely sure, but it felt like this year we saw a lot more of Tosh Lupoy with a play card and signal or relaying plays into Jeff Basso, who was one of the guys. He was the primary guy that had the play calls coming in through his helmet on defense there. So Hampton leaving one day, I mean, he just pulled off whatever you think of Oregon secondary right now. Chris Hampton played a pretty darn pivotal role in the best defensive back recruiting class Oregon has ever had. Ever. I don't think there is another class, frankly, that would be close. The next closest one would be, 2024's class. That would be the next closest defensive back haul. So they've loaded up at this position. He has recruited well. I think the secondary has certainly not had every single moment be their brightest, but overall, they have been quite good. And since Hampton came in, I've liked what he's brought to the table. But him getting lured away, yeah, it would make a whole heck of a lot of sense, and I think would then really allow us to directly assess Tosh Lupoy as a defensive coordinator. And I know some of you out there aren't super high on Tosh. I'd encourage you to go look at what the defense has been over the last few years, and also remember that Dan Lanning is not uninvolved with any of this. One of my least favorite narratives in media or online circles is, well, this coach isn't calling the plays, so what's he really doing? This drives me insane. If you do not believe that during the Ohio State game, they showed some of the conversations they had, but as the game is getting called, which we all know from, inside access that we all get, or peek behind the curtain rather, on Ducks versus them, they all hear each other and talk to each other on the headset. If you don't think Lanning is giving any input to Tosh, I think you were pretty crazy there. So if Hampton were to leave, it would be right back to, okay, there's nobody else there. Good, bad, indifferent, anything in between. This is just all on Tosh Lupoy. So we'll see if this ends up playing itself out. But right now, it kind of feels, I don't know where Ohio State is looking for their defensive coordinator. But where did their past defensive coordinator go? Well, I'm so glad you asked. Or maybe perhaps not. So there was a bit of coaching poaching, which is a rhyming term I just came up with and I'm way too proud of, that took place in the Big Ten. And Jim Knowles, who was the defensive coordinator at Ohio State this past year, he is now the defensive coordinator at Penn State. This is bad news for Oregon. No other way to slice it. Now, in the first matchup, after the first matchup with Ohio State, I should say, wouldn't have felt as bad about this, because maybe, if things had played out differently, if there'd still been a 14 playoff, the perception of Jim Knowles would be very different. But dating back to where he was before his time in Columbus, he was at Oklahoma State, and he was really, really good there as well. He is an excellent defensive play caller, clearly knows how to coach his guys up and have them ready to go. You give him a bunch of NFL players like Ohio State had this past year, and that's the result. National championship season. And Ryan Day, turns out, really good head coach. Chip Kelly, great offensive coordinator. Jim Knowles, great defensive coordinator. So after the first matchup, I wouldn't have been as worried about this. But after seeing what he did, making adjustments to what Oregon did the first time, and really what he did to everybody throughout Ohio State's championship playoff run, not wild about him now being over at Penn State, who Oregon has to play on the road next year. So that was already going to be Oregon's toughest game. And Jim Knowles being there absolutely makes it tougher, because as I talked about, I haven't watched every play back yet. It's still too fresh. Maybe once we turn to February, I'll go back and watch every play of the Rose Bowl and have some more thoughts and takeaways and such. But my biggest takeaway at the time, and the more I've let these thoughts marinate, the more I think that it is true, especially watching this whole playoff run for Ohio State and how it played out. Oregon got outcoached. So Jim Knowles, on that day, January 1st, 2025, it was him against Will Stein. And Jim Knowles won, and it wasn't particularly close. No points until the end of the first half with the final play and 2-point conversion. Like that was an exquisite coaching performance. They did that defense was really well coached. They avoided penalties. They played good assignment football. They had the right play calls. They passed off coverage as well. They anticipated things really well. Everything about that defense to me screamed, this is really, really good coaching. Now, the reason reportedly that he left Ohio State was strife with the coaches. He didn't get along with the defensive line coach, I don't think, or Ryan. I think it was more about the D-line coach. I'm not entirely sure, but essentially he's from Pennsylvania originally, so he's back close to home in Happy Valley, and now he is on a staff that I presume he'll be able to get along with better, but also a team that has national championship aspirations. And yeah, they lose a couple guys to the NFL draft like Abdul Carter, but they bring back a lot. 4 starters from their offensive line, Drew Aller at quarterback. They got some help with the portal at wide receiver. Penn State is absolutely loading up. So before all this went down, Penn State was Oregon's toughest game because it's a favorable schedule. And why I don't agree with the premise or with what ESPN has projected in their playoff that, Oregon can't get to 10-2. No, I think they can get to 10-2. I think if you gave them last year's schedule, maybe not. But even that schedule, it wasn't as bad as some of the other ones that I see across college football in the SEC, Big Ten, or even in the ACC. Miami's got a brutal schedule with how everything works out. They have 2 byes in a 3-week span, and then they play 7 straight games to end the year, and the final 2 of those games are on the road in conference play. So Oregon has gotten scheduling breaks each of the last couple of seasons. That won't always be the case, but this was always the toughest game, no matter how you looked at that schedule, because there's no Ohio State, there's no Michigan on it. And maybe Washington sneaks up and is tougher than some people might think. But now this game, absolutely tougher. Knowles is really good, and Will Stein will get a chance to make it 2-1 against him. Because first go round, I'm not saying that Knowles is just going to automatically clown Will Stein again and hold Oregon's offense scoreless in the first half. Now it's going to be on the road, so everything is going to be more difficult. But first matchup, Autzen Stadium, advantage Will Stein significantly. This is the second time that Oregon beating Ohio State in the regular season has caused a shakeup on the defensive staff. The shakeup this time around in the 2024 season was they have to make some schematic changes. They started blitzing a little bit more, not just sitting off in coverage and always just rushing 3 or 4 and dropping 8. They brought a little more pressure, and that really worked. They played a little bit more aggressively. And back in 2021, it was get rid of then defensive coordinator, I don't remember his name, and bring in Jim Knowles because he's really, really good. So he's at Penn State now, and that's just not great. There's no other way to slice it. Not great, Bob. Not great. Tougher. I believe in Oregon's ability to go there and win that football game. I'm not making a prediction right now. I'm just saying I don't look at that and say, it's automatically a loss. No, it's a losable game. Oregon will probably be an underdog. Could they win it? Yeah, it's still James Franklin and Penn State playing what will likely be a very big football game. Their track record there isn't very good, but bringing a guy like Jim Knowles helps a whole heck of a lot. Staff shakeups, man. You just never really Get away from them. It's just always revolving, round and round they go. So I love Oregon's weapons for next year. Speaking of Will Stein, how will he use some of those weapons? Can he use all of those weapons? Not going to be easy. All right, a couple mailbag questions to wrap up today's show, which, if you're Locked On Ducks Insider, like where this question came from, you get priority mailbag access, free 14-day trial with that link in the description below. Got a question for the pod that might be a fun idea for next year to help keep opposing defenses off balance. Could we see Oregon run receivers in different spots randomly? Kyler Casper in a receiving tight end role in certain plays due to his size, or Evan Stewart running some slot routes to make mismatches in said spot or others. I feel like Oregon has the diversity of certain talents in the room to really keep defenses off balance to create an advantage outside of just pure talent, but it can also potentially keep the receivers fresh since we got hit hard in receiver injuries last year. Well, as for the injury part of it, that's why recruiting matters and depth matters, and the ability to have, a guy in his third year of college football to step up when Evan Stewart goes down or Tez Johnson goes down and Justice Lowe. That's why recruiting matters. That's why when I talk about the offensive line, I mentioned the 3 rotation guys behind, because all of a sudden, one injury and boom, suddenly that's one of the 11 most important players on one side of the ball. But as for your question about how Oregon uses the weapons, I actually think they've done a good job of being creative with how they get guys the ball. I have seen Kenyon Sadiq line up in the backfield. I've seen him line up offset on the end line out wide. He goes all over the place. Tez Johnson last year a couple times lined up in the backfield and ran, some angle or option routes that can be tough to defend and guarantees that you get a free release, because if you're right up on the line of scrimmage, DB can jam you. Well, you can't jam a running back coming out of that position. Now, you can't do that every time because that's not, what you're trying to accomplish offensively or from a formation standpoint. And if you do the same thing over and over and over, then eventually they're going to catch on and make an adjustment. I mean, EA College Football 25 doesn't know that, but real defensive coordinators do. So I like what they've done, and I'm glad you brought up Kyler Casper, because I think it flew under the radar a bit this year because we were all, myself included, caught up in, the run Oregon was going on and how great things were and 13 and all that stuff. Kyler Casper looked like he was going to have a clearly defined role until he got hurt. And then we didn't see him the rest of the season. I don't think it was a big role per se, but he caught that long pass in the first game against Idaho, and I thought, whoa, hey, there he is. That's the biggest play of his career so far. It was like a 17, 20-yard reception down the field. He ran a corner route, big frame, easy target, boom, catch the ball. Then he drew a pass interference in the Oregon State game, and that's kind of the last we heard from him outside of some special teams instances. But I think Will Stein, going into last year, he made some comments about, I got to be able to get this guy the ball, or we want to, when he first got hired to Oregon, the quote that I think everyone associated with him was feed the studs, right? Is you want to get the ball to your best players in one-on-one situations as often as you can. I think he does a pretty good job of that, quite frankly. I know not everyone does, but Oregon has so many different options that they might have to get creative if they're going to get as many people involved as they want. And I don't know that Kyler Casper could go and play the tight end position, because you have to be able to block at a higher level than you do as a receiver, because as a tight end, you have to be able to at least hold your ground, if not outright move around linebackers and defensive linemen, defensive ends mostly. Not having to do that on the perimeter against defensive backs. But I think Casper would have continued being a part of Oregon's red zone offense, and he just ended up getting hurt. And I think at times, we saw Oregon's red zone offense struggle at times. Having a 6'5" guy to throw the ball up to, yeah, I'm here for it. And I think Oregon has seen that potential. So I'm curious to see. He's not in the transfer portal. He clearly sees some path to playing time, or else I think he would have gone and explored his options elsewhere. So going into his 4th season now, which is crazy, but going into his 4th season, yeah, he could have the biggest role of his career, because he hasn't had a significant role yet, but I think he would have had another one this past season, not lining up in a different spot, but just being on the field. Because, You can't teach height. He's 6'5". That's a big frame to throw the ball up to. And Kenyon Sadiq is 6'3", 6'4", and he's got crazy jumping ability. We saw him get the ball twice in the red zone in the Big Ten championship game. And I think that'll continue as his career progresses as well. But I actually like and appreciate how Will Stein moves guys around, gets some free releases with motion. They did that a lot with Tez Johnson over the last couple of years, especially in 2023, where, you motion a guy all the way across the formation, hard for a DB to jam him. And a guy as agile as Tez, who was cooking some dudes at the Senior Bowl yesterday, that's just going to be a really, really tough matchup. So I'm with your thought that you want to get the ball to as many weapons as you can. I don't know that you can get it to everyone and maximize everyone's potential because there's only one ball and there's only so many passing plays. But end of the day, I think there has been formational versatility and creativity from Will Stein to get guys the ball in different ways. This one comes in from Hector, and this is a unique question because if I did not seek outside help, which I don't care to do on mailbag questions, I don't know how to answer this one. Maybe some of you do. Some of you have been around Autzen longer than me. Hector asks, how come the Oregon sideline is on the north side instead of the south side of Autzen, where you have club seats and the cover on this side for the sun and rain and weather? I do not know. The stadium was designed a long time ago. I don't know the answer to that question. I apologize for not having that piece of knowledge. It would probably require a discussion with someone who's been around the program for a long time, or the actual architect of Autzen Stadium, or maybe there is no reason and it just kind of exists. Keep the questions coming. Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.